Well, hello everyone and welcome to tonight's Word for Word event with Hannah Witten. I think we can probably go ahead and get started here if we want. Paul, did you want to open, and then Mike, are we recording as well? Okay, we are. Great. We are recording. So Paul, I'll hand it over to you first.
Okay, I'm just pulling up my my script here so that I don't embarrass anyone, including myself. So I'm Paul Whitcover, the Associate Dean of the online MFA program, and I'm here with Jacob Powers, the Associate Dean of the BA and MA Creative Writing programs. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening for our first Word for Word event of the season, featuring New York Times bestselling author Hannah Witten.
So hello again and welcome. Before we get started on everything, I do have some housekeeping items to share. So first, please use the chat window to ask questions once we get to the Q&A. Today's session will be recorded, so you can avoid being recorded by keeping your microphone on mute and not typing in the chat. By participating in the meeting, which means unmuting your microphone or participating in the chat, you are consenting to be recorded. And we encourage you to submit questions to be addressed during the general Q&A session. However, due to time constraints, we might not make all of them.
And with that, I will take over again temporarily to introduce Hannah more formally. Jacob and I are thrilled to have Hannah Witten as our guest today. Her first novel, a remarkable fantasy called For the Wolf, which is book one of the Wilderwood series, was published to critical acclaim in June of 2021. In a starred review, Publishers Weekly praised the novel as dark and dazzling, while Tor.com called it a haunting, beautifully told tale. And I've read the novel and can attest to the veracity of those endorsements. Hannah has been writing to amuse herself since she could hold a pen, and sometime in high school figured out that what amused her might also amuse others. When she's not writing, she's reading, making music, or attempting to bake. She lives in an old farmhouse in Tennessee with her husband, children, 2 cats, a dog, and probably some ghosts. Ooh, nice. So Hannah, I'm going to ask you to read a little bit from your novel, and before you do, if you care to, maybe you could preface a little bit with giving us some context of what you're going to read, or just speaking a little bit in general about the novel. Of course, we'll dig in with more specific questions afterward. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right. So I picked out the passage that I'm going to read today, and I practiced it today. I am not great at reading aloud, so if you hear me mess up, no, you didn't. But this is whenever Red first enters the Wilderwood on her 20th birthday. She's the second daughter of Valeda, and anytime a second daughter is born, they are owed to the wolf and get kicked into the forest on their 20th birthday. So here's how that goes down. It was colder in the Wilderwood. The temperature dropped instantly, cool enough to make her glad of her cloak. As Red crossed the tree line, pressing into that infernal hum, bruising pressure built against her skin. It was almost enough to make her stumble onto the forest floor, almost enough to make her cry out. But the pressure and the hum were gone as soon as she settled both feet beyond the forest border, leaving her in leaves and deep, undisturbed silence. The only thing that moved was the fog, a sinuous crawl over the ground. Beneath the sleeve of her gown and the heavy crimson of her cloak, the mark gave one more twinge. Then the feeling of that subtle pull was gone. Red rubbed at it absently. The trees were strange. Some were short and gnarled, but others grew tall and straight, their bark unnaturally white until it met the forest floor. There it bent and twisted, dark rot standing out in ropes like corroded veins. Some of the trees had the rot only around the roots, but on others the corrosion stretched up taller than Red. The white trees had limbs only at the crown, swoops of graceful bone-like bark, just like the branch shards in the shrine. One white tree stood just inside the forest border. Black rot grew over halfway up its trunk. Even the ground around it seemed dark and smelled somehow cold. The nearby trees, brown-barked and thatched with irregular branches, had no rot on them at all. Other than the trees, Red was alone. With deep, shaky breaths, she willed her heart out of her throat. Her unwanted magic curled through her ribs, a languid unfurling, a subtle hit of green etching her veins. She expected it to riot, to race for release, and she clenched her teeth in anticipation of every tree in the damn forest reaching for her. But her power stayed docile, almost like it was waiting for something. Still, there was an awareness here. Red was seen, Red was marked. The trees knew her, they remembered. Her blood on the forest floor, a terrible rushing, a gift of power she didn't want and couldn't control. For a brief, blinding second, Red wished for a match, even though she'd know it'd do her no good. Sayetha's mother tried to burn down the wilderwood, and so had Neve. It did nothing. The back of her wrist pressed against her teeth, a hissing breath pulled through her nose. She didn't want the wilderwood to see her cry. When the threat of tears passed, Red tightened her grip on her bag of books and peered into the gloom. No use prolonging the inevitable. "I'm here," it reverberated, echoing and distorting, tuned to minor keys by space and silence. Then, with the mad specter of a laugh in her throat, "Am I acceptable?" Nothing happened. Fog drifted silently, tangling and curling through branches, dead leaves. Frustration drove her teeth together, the despair of seconds ago transmuting into fierce anger. She felt roots arching toward her under her feet, felt bone-shard boughs stretching over her head. Instinct told her to fight the magic down, but this was the wilderwood, where it belonged, where it had been born. "I'm here, shadows, damn you," she screamed into the gloom. "Come collect your sacrifice, wolf." The wilderwood seemed to bend toward her, anticipating, like she had something it wanted. The recklessness was gone as soon as it came. Spots spun in Red's eyes as she gasped, fists closing, or trying to. Her fingers were held straight by the forest floor beneath them. Her brow furrowed at the sight of her hands against the ground. She didn't remember kneeling, didn't remember pressing them to the dirt. Before she had a chance to stand, her hands began to sink. In an instant, soil covered her arms to the wrist, her fingers dropping deep to tangle in thready roots. They brushed against her hands like sentient things, searching proddingly at her knuckles, the creases of her palms. A sharp prick at her nail bed, the slithering feeling of a root trying to work its way into her skin. Red's heart ratcheted, panic closing her throat as she desperately tried to work free, wrenching her hands in the dirt to escape that probing root. Branches brushed against her scalp, tangled in her hair, laying claim. The magic in her center reached forward, slow but implacable, a vine growing through a summer that counted days in her quickened heartbeat. It felt like it would reach right out of her skin to meet the force that made it. No. Her teeth cracked together. Red forced her magic down, swallowed that dirt taste, pressed until she thought she might collapse from the effort of folding part of herself up and hiding it away. Sweat stood out on her brow when her magic was finally contained, coiled back into the places she'd made for it. Her wrist burned green with power she wouldn't let loose. Red yanked her hands free of the forest floor. Broken root tendrils slithered away as she wiped her palms on her knees like snakes going back to burrow. 3 white trees bent toward her, and all seeming closer than they had a moment ago. Their graceful, swooping branches dipped low, a hand frozen right before it reached to caress. A soft sound boiled, spilled over. For a moment, it almost sounded like a voice, like a word. But it broke apart before Red could make sense of it, fading into nothing but breeze and rustling leaves. In the following silence, 3 blossoms dropped from the same bough of a flowering bush, one of many dotting the forest floor. The small white blooms were brown and withered before they hit the ground. It gave Red the unsettling impression of a price being paid. Swallowing hard, she stood, hitching her bag over her shoulder. "I suppose I'll have to find you then." She set off into the woods. Red didn't know how long she'd been walking when the thicket rose before her, grown up around one of the white trees. Short, scrubby bushes wrapped the trunk, thorns pointed outward at wicked angles. Through the close growth, Red could barely see the black rot spreading up the tree, crawling toward the clustered branches at the top. A thorn caught in her hood as she tried to skirt around the thicket, one she'd swear hadn't been there before. The crimson fabric pulled back from her face. Another dagger-sharp thorn drew a bloody line down her cheekbone. Red clapped her hand to the wound, but the damage was done. A bead of blood rolled slowly down the thorn, coming to its end and dropping to another, ever closer to the dark ravaged trunk of the white tree. If she tried to reach through the tangle and smear it away, she'd only catch more thorns, spill more blood. So Red stood and watched and waited, dread roiling beneath her ribs. Her blood touched the white trunk, hesitated. Then the tree absorbed it, took it in like water to parched soil. Tripping over leaves, Red backed away from the tree until she collided with another, this one also thin and pale, also twisted with black rot. Underbrush tangled in her skirts, and Red tore herself away, the rip unnaturally loud in the silent forest. That sound again, reverberating up from the forest floor, rustling leaves and stretching vines and clattering twigs cobbling themselves into something like a voice, something she didn't so much hear as feel. It boiled up from her center, from the shard of magic she kept lashed down through white-knuckle effort. Finally, it's only been one for so long. A tree limb broke from the trunk, fell to the forest floor. It shriveled at once, years of decay packed into seconds, leaving nothing but a desiccated husk. Red's teeth hummed, the hairs on her arms standing on end. Branches arched toward her, roots slithered beneath her feet, and she stood frozen as a deer in the path of an arrow. This was what she'd prepared for in the deepest parts of her mind, the places she didn't have to look at too closely. She'd denied it to Neve, saying they didn't know what happened to the second daughters who crossed the border, but she'd known there could be nothing here but death, and she thought she'd prepared for it. Now that it waited, shaped like clawed branches and twisted roots, she realized that preparation wasn't acceptance. All the quiet acquiescence she'd swallowed over 20 years erupted, spilled over, drove her teeth together, not in fear but in rage. She wanted to live and damn the things that said she shouldn't. So Red ran. Vines swung for her, the leaf-strewn ground buckling to trip her feet. The white trees bent and arched as if fighting against invisible bonds, screaming for release. Like the forest was an animal, desperate for her blood, and something held it back. Finally, Red reached a clearing. White trees ringed it, quivering, but she ran to the center where the ground was only moss and dirt. Her knees hit the soil, her breath rasped, skirt in tatters and twigs in her hair. The moment of calm shattered with a sound of splintering wood, one of the white trunks slowly splitting, like a smile cutting from one side of a mouth to another. The trunk opened wider, gleaming with sap-dripping fangs. One by one, smiles cut across the other trunk, smiles full of teeth, smiles that wanted blood. Red lurched up on shaky legs, started running again. Her feet were numb, a stitch pulled at her side, but she ran on and on. Eventually, her knees gave out, vision narrowing to a pinprick. Red collapsed in a pile of leaves, forehead pressed to the ground. Maybe this was the fulfilling of the bargain. The stories of Gaia's body riddled with root and rot. Maybe the wolf wouldn't decide whether or not she was an acceptable sacrifice until after his wilder wood consumed her like it consumed Gaia in the end, waiting to see if it spat out the kings in return. Maybe he'd been the one holding it back as she ran, whetting its appetite with the chase to unleash it when she was spent. Red's eyes closed against the expectation of teeth in her neck. A minute, two, nothing happened. Sweat sticking her hair to her face, she looked up. An iron gate rose from the ground. Double her height, it stretched from side to side, curving around before disappearing into the gloom. Pieces of a castle showed through gaps in the metal. A tower, a turret, a ruin half consumed by the forest around it, but it was something. Red stood on shaky legs. Slowly, she pressed her hand to the gate. It didn't open. Red's eyes flickered over the iron as she nervously wiped her hands on her torn skirt. If there was a latch, it was too small to see. No hinges either. The gate was one unbroken piece of iron. It rose to two swirling points as if to mark an entrance, but the bar down the center was as solid as the rest of it. Kings on shitting horses. Teeth bared, Red slammed her hand against the metal. She'd made it through a fanged forest. She could find a way to open a damn gate. A rustle. Red glanced over her shoulder. Only two of the white trees were visible in the gloom, but both of them looked closer than they had before. I'm going to stop there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Hannah. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Sorry if the Tennessee accent was overwhelming at any point.
No, no, not at all. Very much enjoyed it. So thank you again for coming today. It's wonderful to hear the genre read aloud like this and stuff in this capacity and everything. So I guess at this point, let's probably move on to a couple of scripted questions first that we had, Paul and I, specifically about your book, For the Wolf, and then we can move on to a general Q&A from the audience as well. So your website is called In the In-Between. So that's a phrase that evokes the liminal spaces of so much fantasy and of the wilder wood in your novel. What does the in-between mean to you as a writer?
I guess it's something that you get to play in a lot in fantasy, and like specific to my work, I find that I am drawn very much to gray areas, both like setting wise and thematically, of kind of interrogating those spaces between not just like good and bad, but also like what you were taught versus what the truth is. Kind of what you think whenever you're young versus what you think whenever you have more experience. So in fantasy, you kind of get the ability to make that a very literal thing, like sticking people in a forest that's a very much an in-between space. Actually, in early drafts of For the Wolf, the Wilderwood was called the Limerea, which was a play on the word liminal. I studied literature in college and wrote a big term paper on like liminality in Irish literature. So it's always been something that just kind of went part and parcel with writing for me and with the stories that I tend to want to tell. So it seemed natural to make it a website title.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Paul, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, what you say about the gray spaces there also is so resonant with the personal history of your characters. There's memories that may or may not be true. There are pasts that they were told were the truth, only to learn later that the real truth might be somewhat different. And I think that's one of the amazing things of your novel is how you're able to kind of peel those layers back bit by bit in a way that is so, I mean, it's very suspenseful, obviously, but it's also incredibly satisfying because it all comes together and makes sense.
Thank you.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but maybe not so much. Upon looking at the cover of your novel, a reader might expect a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, which is kind of what I expected when I saw the cover. But in fact, you are casting a much wider net. Beauty and the Beast, Bluebeard, Sleeping Beauty, Hansel and Gretel, Snow White and Rose Red, all of these and more are unraveled and rewoven in For the Wolf. And I have to say that one of the real pleasures for me in reading this novel was the discovery of how adroitly you were doing that, and also just this sheer scope of it. How many fairy tales you were bringing in. I was just like, oh my gosh, she cannot possibly juggle another one, but then there it would be. So what is it that draws you to classic fairy tales, and why do you think they resonate with readers today?
I think it goes back to kind of what I was saying for liminal spaces, kind of getting to play in that space of things that you heard whenever you were younger, and then looking at them with fresh eyes as you get older and have more experience. So fairy tales are kind of all of our first fantasy foray, like whether you go hardcore and go for the grim stuff or if you're watching Disney movies. So it is kind of a cultural touchstone that we all have, and even like cross-culturally, because a lot of the very basic storylines of many fairy tales can be found in a bunch of different cultures. So that's an interesting phenomenon to me just in general. Like the fact that whenever we tell ourselves stories, we tend to kind of go back to these same themes over and over again. So that was something that I wanted to do with Wolf, was make it seem like the fairy tale that all of these other things have like split off from. Like,
right.
It wasn't meant so much as a retelling as like a myth in and of itself, that you could trace how from this story, from this thing happening, all these other stories had filtered out.
Fascinating.
And how do you keep it all organized, I guess? Thinking from
I don't.
No, from a novelist, I mean, like a lot of our students I know are very much the goal is to write that, fantasy novel, and there are a lot of different storylines, obviously, and a lot of different fantasy novels in that way, and to be able to keep it all straight in one's head, or to outline it. I mean, it seems like in this case, it's hard to imagine this novel was like rigidly outlined, just the way that it was written. So did it follow a more organic process, or can you talk about that a little bit? Or
Yes. So I rewrote this book at least 4 times completely, because the first draft, I had no idea what I was doing. And it was very much just writing it for myself and writing it for fun, and just shoving as much self-indulgent stuff as I could into it. And so then my revising process after that, both revising with critique partners before I got an agent and then revising with my agent, my editor later on, was kind of finding ways to keep all of that self-indulgent stuff, but in a way that made sense. So it very much was written very organically to begin with for a first draft. And then I outlined kind of as I was revising more, but the experience of writing Wolf was just the story it really came together very organically without a whole lot of pre-planning. Like, I did not intentionally at first want to bring in all those fairy tales. It was just kind of something that as I was writing and as I was figuring the story and the characters out, it happened. And then like a lot of my experience with revising is like writing something, kind of discovering it, and then realizing that it fixed a whole lot of other stuff. So it was strange in that way. It came together really easily. I say it doesn't sound like it came together really easily whenever I read it 4 times, but every time that I rewrote it, it was very much like getting closer to what it was supposed to be the whole time.
And it seems like in a way you made it kind of a rule for yourself not to limit yourself to anything, right? Yeah. To kind of say, well, the sky's the limit, right? Especially in this genre, you can kind of explore a lot of different ways. And in doing so, you had pointed out that in some cases that it resolved some of the issues that happened.
Yeah, I have found, and even as I've worked on other books, like the sequel to For the Wolf and the new series that I'm working on now, my style whenever I'm drafting is very much throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. Just everything that I want to put in there, I put in there, and then I'm not going to be able to keep some stuff, but that's okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
All right, now it's my turn. You're getting tag teamed here. I want to talk a little bit about some of the writing technique that you use in this novel, because I think it's very interesting, a lot of the stuff that you're doing, and I want to just kind of point to one thing I noticed in particular. It's how much attention you pay in your writing to like hands and body parts. And I think that writing students often have difficulty knowing how and when to focus on physical details like these. They either ignore them entirely or focus on them too much. But in your writing, hands especially, and the gestures they make become expressions of emotion in ways that seem natural and unforced. So I really admired that. And I wondered if you could, draw the curtain back on your technique and give us some tips or clue us into how you came to develop that.
Yeah, sure. I will say to start off with that I am very much someone who tends to do it too much. And so one of my consistent notes from my editor in my edit letters is like, you need to take out about 1/3 of these. So that I definitely lean very far into that. But I also am just a person who talks with my hands, which I'm sure has been obvious for, the past 10 minutes. So it feels very natural to me, especially when I'm writing dialogue, people having a conversation, that they would use their hands in that, both to like emphasize what they're saying and to kind of give you clues to what they're not saying, which especially whenever you're writing romance is like pretty much just as important as what people aren't saying. I am also a writer who is very visual. Like I see what I am writing in my head like a movie, and then I am just trying to transcribe it onto the paper. So I am seeing all the gestures that people are making and what they would do as they were having a conversation like this or having thoughts like this, those kinds of things. So I think that with body language, the key is to, if you're going to do it, make the conscious decision to do it and use it like a tool versus a crutch. Because I think a lot of people, me included, tend to kind of have the one movement that they rely on a lot, like raising eyebrows or like shaking heads, things like that, that they kind of default to whenever you need a beat in the conversation. So instead of doing that, I try to really zero in on what a couple of physical tics of a character would be that would make sense for them. And rely on those enough to where it is obvious that like this is a physical tic, this is a personality trait of this person, more so than it just being like they needed to do something here, so this is what they did. And the reason that I think I used hands so much in Wolf was because the main thrust of the plot was a romance. And if you are writing primarily for people who are like romantically attracted to men, hands are just a thing. Good hands are a thing. I have found actually in the book that I'm working on now for the new series, which it has romance, but it's not nearly as much of like a thrust of the plot as it was in the Walderwood books, that I am focusing on hands much less often, just because since it's not a romance, since that's not kind of what the undercurrent of a lot of the conversations and character interactions are, hands just aren't something that occur to me as much. So yeah.
I love what you say about a tool rather than a crutch. And it's interesting to me to hear you mention that it seems as though you consider this novel to be a romance more than a fantasy. Is that like
I definitely consider it to be a fantasy romance. Like it's not genre romance. It is, the fantasy is the genre, but the most important part to me as I was writing it, and the part that I feel like carries the emotional resonance of the book, is the romance.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Totally see that. All right, thanks.
So looking at time and everything, I just wanted to ask one more question before we opened it up to the audience and stuff. This is one that we often like to ask our writers and everything, because I think it's one that students often want an answer for. So yeah, and they'll take anything that you can get, right? So is there a piece of advice, right, or a knowledge that you wish you had known when you were still unpublished that you would like to share with our audience today?
Yes. The thing that I wish I had known whenever I was still unpublished is that it is all extremely subjective. And you never stop getting rejections. Like even once you publish a novel, if you hit list, if you sell Netflix your rights, those people are all still experiencing rejections. Like it's not, you don't hit a plateau where suddenly it doesn't happen anymore. And it's just part of the game. And anything that is art focused is going to be super subjective. People are going to love it. People are going to hate it. And you just have to be able to be okay with the fact that you did what you set out to do and you did that well. And that it doesn't matter how good your cherry pie is. There's some people that just don't like cherry pie. And that's a thing. And my advice is to be your own target audience. Going back to throwing everything at the wall and being as self-indulgent as possible. If you are not having fun, then nobody else will be either. So just everything you love, all the tropey stuff, any character stuff you want to do, write for yourself first. Write something that is going to give you joy to work on, because you are going to work on it until you never want to look at it again.
That is wonderful advice, because that is something that when I was going through my MFA and everything, it wasn't like be your own target audience. It was like think of someone in particular or a specific target audience that you need, and that can get very stressful, right?
Yes.
And you start to try to adapt to that, and because of it, you lose your voice, you lose your style, you lose the fun of it. So it's wonderful to hear that, because it's ultimately what it boils down to is it's something that we all enjoy doing, right?
Yeah. And if you lose the enjoyment of doing it, what's the point?
Exactly. And, if you get those rejections, and yes, they come at every level and stuff, it's just keep trying, right? I mean, there's a lot of, just because one person might not like your story doesn't mean that someone else will they might love it. So you might just want to send it out more and more and see what you can find out.
I do know a lot of people too that end up with novels, particularly who have a backlist whenever they finally end up signing with an agent or selling a novel, and just because it wasn't the right time for that, or maybe it wasn't the best thing to market as a debut, they end up selling that backlist. So
yes,
it's
yes.
not dead.
Yeah, that is a wonderful thing to keep in mind as well too.
Yeah.
Like, don't incinerate your work.
Yeah, keep it.
handy. Yeah, keep it
Yeah.
handy. Keep it saved. Make sure you have backups, and
Yeah,
you know,
and you can always like poach it for other stuff too. I have
exactly.
Yeah, I had a novel that I wrote while Wolf was on submission that I loved very much, but was broken beyond repair, and I could not figure out how to fix it. And I have poached so much from that draft to use in other projects. So
That's
it's all
awesome.
useful. No piece of writing is wasted.
Right. Awesome. Yes. So keep everything handy. Keep all the journals, keep all the notebooks, folks.
Yes.
Do all of it. All right. All right. Well, we are at time now to open up the floor for questions from you, the audience. So if you'd like to go ahead and type some questions into the chat, like I said, we might not be able to get to all of them, but we can go ahead and start asking a few of them to Hannah. And Paul, would you like to start off?
Yeah, I'm just going to scroll through here and
right.
see what I can see.
Sounds good. I've got to pop open the chat to see them. So,
all right, let's see here. So here's a question that kind of touches on something that we discussed, but goes into it a little bit deeper. When I read the book, this is from Moria. She says, when I read the book, I noticed elements of the Beauty and the Beast, Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, and Rose Red fairy tales, but it was also wholly original. And she asks, did you start out thinking about a particular fairy tale to retell?
Red Riding Hood was the first one that I thought of because it was so much a morality tale and like purity story, and I wanted to skewer that. So I knew that I wanted to do that one first and foremost, but then really all that I had from that is like girl wears cloak, girl goes in woods, there's someone called a wolf, because like I knew that I wanted a romantic element, and you really can't make bringing baked goods to your grandma sexy in any way. So that's when I brought in Beauty and the Beast, because it just seemed to kind of naturally follow the trajectory of how I wanted to subvert Red Riding Hood. And at that point, it was just kind of off to the races.
this was an interesting one because often, you know, we're put into workshops when we're in writing classes and stuff, and we have a community that's kind of preloaded for us, right? We have that community that we share our work with. But once we leave that classroom, you know, the communities can vary and stuff. So how big is your writing community? Like, do you workshop with fellow writers of the same genre? How do you approach the feedback aspect of the work that you're working on?
Yeah, the pool of people that I share work with whenever it is in that very new stage is pretty small. Erin Craig is a friend of mine. She writes YA fantasy. She's the author of House of Salt and Sorrows, and we were like querying at the same time, on submission at the same time. She's like my writer best friend, and so we will alpha read for each other and like send like hot off the presses chapters to each other, and be like, I can tell something is wrong here, but I don't want to look at it anymore. Please tell me what you think. And then I also have another writing group that's like 5 people that is mostly just like a friend group. Like we just have a group chat where we can talk about like publishing and our lives in general, but we also do that where we send stuff back and forth. I did unfortunately meet all of them on Twitter, so I'm going to have to like put in a plug for joining Twitter, as much as it galls me. But that's where I met most of them, and we were just we were in the same spot on our journeys and fit together really well.
That's good. Those kind of support groups are so important, and
Yes.
and I mean, you know, I would just like to tell the students that are listening, like, you're in an MFA right now, so take advantage of forming those connections.
Yeah.
You're in an MFA, you're in an MA, you're in the BA with other writers. So make those connections now, because they will stand you in good stead later.
Mhm.
Here's another question. As someone who sees the pictures or movie in their own head before writing, how do you make sure people understand your writing in the way you want them to? In other words, how do you find the right way to describe what is in your head on paper?
Lots of sighing heavily at the ceiling.
Gee, that never works for me.
I refine prose pretty intently. Generally, whenever I'm doing a first draft, it's just kind of like running into the wall, like type really fast, make sure I get all of the action beats down. Like, here is everything that needed to happen and all of it has happened, but it doesn't sound the way that I want it to yet. So then, like, my second and third passes whenever I'm editing is to go into those places that I see it, but I have not projected it the way that I want it to be yet, and just work at it until I'm happy with, or at least until I can live with it. But yeah, it's very much a process, and it doesn't get there in one or even two passes usually. Like, it takes a while for me to be happy with how things are coming across on the page.
Do you find like that you are writing from a kind of a consistent visualization in your head that you're refining closer and closer to on paper, or do you find that it's a reciprocal, process where you see something in your head, you work to get it across on paper, but in doing so, that kind of causes you to look again, maybe more deeply at what's in your head and change it a little bit?
Yeah, I do that. Mostly it is, I see it in my brain and I am trying to like work to get the words to reflect that. But I will often see it in my brain and try to reflect it in the words and then be like, that doesn't work the way that I wanted it to. And then at that point, it's not necessarily like an unconscious trading back and forth. It's that the way that I envisioned this castle makes no sense and I should fix that.
So do you ever find yourself, there's a few questions about writer's block, and it's a common theme that happens, especially when you are pursuing a novel or something, and it's like, oh, what next, right? Do you ever encounter that yourself? Because it sounds like you often will hit something and then say, oh, well, I just need to rework it, or I might, branch out and just try something completely new. I mean, how do you navigate writer's block, if you have it at all, and do you have any advice for those who do have it?
Yeah, I don't have it as much now, but I very much think of writing as a muscle, and it's one of those things that the more you use it, the better you're going to be. So if because I do it for a job, I have to use it a lot, and so it's not something that I run into as much anymore, but it does still happen. And usually if I have run into a block on a novel, it's because I did something wrong before. If I can't visualize a way to go forward, it's because something behind me is wrong. So usually what I will do is go back to the last point where I made a decision, like an important plot thrusting decision, and do something different. And usually that will fix it for me. I'm still not much of an outliner, but at this point I do, just because deadlines. So if I run into something huge, then I have usually, like, I can ping one of my critique partners or my agent or my editor and be like, hey, can we talk through this? Because a lot of times just having somebody that you can talk through it with, you'll kind of solve the problem on your own, like just through the process of trying to explain it to somebody else. Something clicks. So those are the two ways that I usually will approach it. If it's writer's block on an idea, like if it's less so much like I have started this novel and I have gotten to the midpoint, now I don't know what happens next, and it's more like I have this idea but I don't know how to execute it, that the cure for that is just time, and just letting something kind of marinate in the back of your head. Don't underestimate the power of the subconscious, because it's going to be turning that idea over to figure it out. and then, it will spring forth fully formed whenever it is ready. But if it's not ready, don't try to force it because you're just going to frustrate yourself.
That's all excellent advice that I wish I had been given long ago. I mean, all of it is like, yes, that all makes perfect sense. I really like the idea of like, if something's not working, it's from behind, right?
Yeah,
so it's almost like going back to that last save point and saying, okay, instead of walking through the door, maybe the character doesn't walk through the door, and that might change the trajectory enough to get it to that vision that you eventually want to get to, right? The ultimate climax of the novel and everything. So that's wonderful advice. I think that is very handy. Put that in my back pocket. Thank you.
I have another question. So when you were writing Wolf, as we discussed, you're aiming to kind of write the fairy tale that all the other fairy tales came out of, and kind of in doing that, you had to draw in a lot of kind of fairy tales, and I guess untangle them and then reweave them back into their more primal form, keeping some elements, getting rid of some other elements. How did you decide what to keep in the original fairy tales that you wove into your new fairy tale, and how did you decide what not to keep?
I mostly kept only things that were either very much a touchstone of the original fairy tale, like Red's cloak, and things that fit, because I knew what I wanted to do with the main plot and like how I wanted it to end, what I wanted the emotional beats to be, and so if something didn't fit with those, I just didn't use it. But I think that if you're aiming to do a retelling or a reimagining of something, it is really important to have your endpoint in mind from the beginning. Like I said that Wolf came together very organically. It did, but I knew how it wanted to end, and the ending never really changed. Like through all of the revisions and the reworkings and stuff, the end was always very similar to what it is now. So if you start with an endpoint in mind and you kind of know what you're writing toward and what you're wanting to point toward, it makes it very easy to see the pieces that are not going to fit and things that are going to disrupt that. So for me, a big part of revising is streamlining toward the end and just getting rid of all the extra stuff that isn't pointing toward the end.
That my transition into the idea like of cutting back, right? Killing your darlings, that the idea of that and everything. How do you go about it? So you have that goal in mind and everything. And it sounded like, if I recall, you put everything out there, right? Just put it all on the page and stuff. So I assume there's a lot of backing and cutting back and doing parts. Like I often will encounter like students who say, if the short story limit is 8 to 12 pages, they're like, but I got 15 pages. Can I turn in 15? And I like to challenge them, like, try to get it down to 12. What advice do you have for folks like that? Because conciseness is important. Like, no matter how vast and long and big the fantasy novel may eventually become, you still need to be concise in your language in ways that you're not losing your audience and stuff. So do you have any advice on like that the process of cutting back
Yeah. So my overarching advice is to just be ruthless with killing things. I know it's hard to cut really good prose, but you will write more really good prose. If you find yourself having to twist yourself in knots to keep something, just cut it. Like you will find other things to love. From a very like technical kind of cheating standpoint, you can get rid of most of your dialogue tags. And also, if you're going to use dialogue tags, you don't really need modifiers for them. Like you can just say he said. It doesn't have to be he said quietly, he said softly, he said angrily. You could just leave it at he said and make sure that the dialogue itself is giving the emotion that your reader is going to imagine them saying it softly. Also, meaty verbs. verbs that can carry a lot of descriptive weight can do a lot for making the prose better just in general, and also word count, just because you're not having to modify stuff as much. So anytime you can use just a really good meaty verb, those are the best.
One word's better than 5.
Yes.
Yes.
When you can get there, one word is better than 5.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you. Do you ever regret, like, I mean, I guess, like, is there anything that when you're cutting back, do you regret cutting anything back ever? Or, like, I know you say just be ruthless, but is there a time where, like, well, I'm just going to save this part, maybe put it over in this, you know, in this compartment over here, and maybe use it later on or something like that?
Oh, I do that all the time. Yeah.
Okay.
Have a document that's like a word graveyard, where if you come across just like a really good turn of phrase or line of dialogue or something that you're not going to be able to keep for the project that you're working on, like, still keep it, because you can 100% use it in something else later. Just keep it in your back pocket. But as far as things that I've cut from the story, like, that I liked that didn't end up in projects themselves, there's not really any that I regret, just because I feel like anything that I cut, I had a good reason for cutting, and it ended up making the story better in the long run. But there are like different little character moments and turns of phrase that I didn't get to keep that I think of fondly, and I have saved for future stuff, but I don't regret cutting them from what they got cut from.
It's like what my undergraduate instructor called them words, like, you know, they're B-sides, like, you know, like in writing, like with music and stuff, the B-sides are the stuff that's like, you know, you keep after, you know, it's not the A side.
Yeah.
But don't lose it, because everyone loves the B-sides too, right? So
yeah, I've used like cut scenes and alternate point of view scenes and stuff like that for like newsletter content. And
oh, awesome.
Yeah.
That's
like, just because it's fun for me. People also like it, so.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. That's something you have to think about these days. You know, if you have a newsletter and you know, Patreon or something like that, you have to have content for your patrons, and that's excellent content. You know, here's what didn't make the final cut.
The most wild one that I've done was writing like a college fan fiction alternate universe story for Red and Eamon, where they were like students in a botany department. It was great fun.
That's awesome. I guess we have time for a few more questions. I want to ask you about female protagonists in fantasy. And it's been extremely refreshing and wonderful to see a story like this one where strong women are front and center. And I guess I would just like to ask you about your feelings about you know, female protagonists, I guess, in fantasy, and where you think the genre is in that regard now.
Yeah. I think that we're kind of in a heyday of that right now. There are so many really amazing fantasy authors that are working and are writing really cool non-cis men-led books. So I think that there's been a little bit of a sea change of, you know, epic fantasy doesn't just have to mean like one lone man with a sword who should be the king and is not. Like, there's a much wider, it feels like, breadth of things that people are writing about now. And something that I wanted to do with Wolf in particular is write female protagonists that were still very feminine, and it wasn't kind of a trade-off of you get to be strong girl but only because you have sword kind of thing. I didn't want hallmarks of femininity to be seen as a weakness, but I also feel like you can kind of go too far in that direction and being like only the feminine is good. So I wanted to have like a very dysfunctional matriarchy. So I think mostly it just comes down to writing everyone as complete and full people in all of that that entails, with strengths and flaws and weird feelings, and just making everyone well-rounded regardless of gender.
Yeah, I mean, and that definitely, I want to talk about Wolf a little bit too, because Wolf is obviously a very important character, and he is a character who in another type of fantasy would have been the lead, but instead he's a very flawed character with a lot of issues that he has to deal with.
You've got baggage.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I just like writing flawed characters, I think. And with Eamon, I didn't want like this super alpha guy, because especially like he's the wolf. And he's, our beast character for Beauty and the Beast thread. And so I just got a particular joy from making him like very grumpy and bookish and like, please don't talk to me. So again, just not being afraid to make your characters very flawed, and trusting that you can write a flawed character and the reader is still going to empathize with them and is still going to want to hear about them. Just not being afraid to really go there as far as letting your characters not be the best all the time.
Are there any writers that have inspired you particularly? Not just in this book. I mean, I kept thinking of Angela Carter as I was reading.
Yes.
But any other writers?
I love Erin Morgenstern.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote The Night Circus, and more recently The Starless Sea, which is one of my very favorite books. I read a lot of Stephen King as a teenager, and I feel like that has really permeated my like writing sense. So him for sure. Catherine Valenti, her work is consistently excellent.
She's wonderful.
Amazing. Yeah. N.K. Jemisin, also just doing really, really bonkers good work. Like her world building is nuts, and it's all like what I strive to do. Like I'm like, that would never even occur to me. I'm trying to think of some more. I really like Clive Barker. I like this is kind of gross, but like the way that Clive Barker writes gore, like he writes it very prettily, and I really like that juxtaposition.
Awesome. I think that's a really good reading list, and I can tell from the chat that you have a lot of folks who agree with you. I'll have to check out The Night Circus. It sounds interesting.
It's very good.
I mean, people are with exclamation points saying it's really good. So,
people go bananas over The Night Circus.
I'm gonna have to check it out. So, well, we are at time. I mean, this went by so quickly and stuff, and it was very wonderful. Always to hear from the author themselves, and to hear the work, but also the process behind it as well. And also, I think ultimately, it's always nice to have the reassurances from getting the answers to those questions. Okay, writer's block does happen to everyone. There are strategies to get around it.
Yeah.
You know, there are. It's nice to know that we're all in good company, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Everybody has such a different process, and every project is a different process, and you just have to trust it and lean into it.
Exactly. So, well, thank you so much, Hannah, for reading. It was wonderful today to have you here today. Folks, please check out Hannah's website. It's hannahfwitten.com, and follow her on Instagram and Twitter as well. The handle is @HWittenWrites. I believe we can put that in the chat as well, if that isn't already. And we're so glad that you were able to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it was wonderful. And
it really was wonderful.
Yes, and just good luck with your future projects and everything like that. I can't wait to see what happens next. And for everyone else, thank you for coming. And be on the lookout for the next Word for Word event. And have a great evening, everyone. All right, take care.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Hannah.
Bye.